Well, let me start by saying that I very much appreciate Max's invitation and this opportunity to have a what I hope is a casual discussion. It was unfortunate in some ways that he made all my good points in his introductory remarks, and there's nothing worse for an aging professor than to disappoint former students, so that I feel a lot of pressure not to fall below the horizon of expectations. But let me start. I mean, Trump so much dominates the political imagination these days that it's hard to talk about U.S. foreign policy without being preoccupied with how to decode what he is doing, because it seems that he himself is not clear about what he's doing, and he has what I call a Hindu sensibility in to the degree that he's not disturbed by contradiction. So, the Western mentality is very much geared to some kind of rational, logical coherence. And even when it does contradict, it doesn't. We all engage in contradictions, but usually we're conscious and sort of try to cover them. He doesn't make any effort to cover his contradictions, and seems to have no memory of what he said a few days earlier. But let me make a few preliminary comments that give a broader context to American foreign policy. The first is that I think we're living, everywhere, humanity is experiencing what I would call the first biopolitical crisis in human history. And by that I mean the species itself is endangered by the kinds of developments that have been taking place. The most obvious source of that danger is climate change, global warming, but also the inability to really address the problem of nuclear weapons in a satisfactory manner. And then there are other issues also, but I would mention global migration as something that requires a global solution, not some interaction of state solutions. And what creates this biopolitical moment is the inability of the present global order to promote global collective goods. That is, what is beneficial not for a particular state or the aggregation of states, but that promotes the global interest or the human interest as a totality. The UN was supposedly set up to achieve that, to protect global interest, but it turns out to be, and in that sense, Trump is quite right. It's an instrumentality for the promotion of distinct national interests. Not real. It's too weak to transcend those national interests and to promote any kind of global interest or human interest. On significant issues, on trivial issues, it can do that, but it can't do that as we've seen with nuclear weapons or with climate change. It can do something. It can provide a mechanism for cooperation, but the cooperation is confined to what governments representing their citizens can agree upon. So one of the great deficiencies of global order at this stage of history is this inability to promote global interests at a time when global interests cannot be ignored. They could be ignored. See, what is significant, in my view, is until very recently, they could be ignored. The worst that could happen would be a given civilization would collapse or suffer catastrophe, or particular countries would be, but nothing, it wouldn't be a biopolitical moment. It wouldn't challenge the species. And therefore, the kind of global order that existed was far from perfect, but it at least was not incapable of protecting human interest in the minimal survival sense. So what I'm really suggesting in this preliminary remark is humanity is faced with this biopolitical imperative. And what it had relied on to cover this deficiency was, to a great extent, the global leadership provided by the US. It was sort of a plan B solution, since, and it really initiated after World War II. And it was expressed by such policies as the Marshall Plan that facilitated economic reconstruction of Europe and in a different way to Japan. And it also was expressed by the leadership exhibited in developing a public order of the oceans, the Law of the Sea Treaty and protection of Antarctica. In other words, global leadership provided by the US, again, far from perfect and having many deficiencies, did disguise this inability or this absence of mechanisms by which to protect the global interest and the human interest. So that's really the first point that I wanted to make. And the second point, which I think Max's introductory comments alluded to, was that the US is not a normal territorial state. It is probably the first global state in human history. It's not an empire. It hasn't got territorial ambitions beyond its sovereign territory. But as Max suggested, it has militarized the planet under its control. And that's never happened before. It has this network of upwards of 1,000 foreign bases, and it does have these navies everywhere, and it's making a big effort to control both cyberspace and atmospheric space. So you have this global security system that is under the control of a single territorial state, and it also is promoting, has been promoting, the global economic order that has again been perceived to be helpful to the world as a whole. So in other words, again, the US global leadership to some extent provided a stable environment for the expansion of trade and investment, and for the period since 1945, that's worked relatively well. So you have these two factors that make it quite difficult to understand U.S. foreign policy. Because on the one side, it purports to be a normal state. A state like other states may be more important. It's one of 5 permanent members of the Security Council. But in a less explicit form, or in an unacknowledged form, it's also a global state with these global responsibilities. And what Max also alluded to, which is part of the Trump phenomenon, is that Trump in his campaign clearly threatened this global state structure, and therefore threatened not only the security system, but also the world economic structure, the neoliberal global capital structure. And for the first time, certainly in my lifetime, 50 prominent Republicans in the security world, ex-CIA directors, former generals, and others, said that they had been lifelong Republicans, but they could no longer vote for Trump, and they were abandoning the Republican Party and voting for Clinton. And this was an open letter that was given quite a lot of publicity, obviously didn't affect the outcome of the election, but it was an indication that the deep security state, the intelligence agencies and the Pentagon, were worried about the consequences of Trump's election. That they thought, first of all, they took seriously what he was saying in his campaign, which turns out he didn't take so seriously after he was elected president, or the alternative view is that rather than endure a real encounter with the deep state, he surrendered. He gave up 2 things that were very troubling to the deep state. One was he promised during the campaign to end what were called regime-changing interventions of the sort the Iraq War represented. He's dropped that kind of language. And he also threatened the global trading framework by saying that he was going to make China suffer from having taken advantage of the U.S. and in particular, and that he was going to be an America First president. It sounded isolationist. There's an ambiguity of this phrase, America First, because it depends whether he meant America First in the normal state rhetoric or America First in the global state rhetoric. And in the campaign, he seemed to be meaning it in the normal state. And that's what worried the national security establishment. Since being elected, he seems to mean America First in the global state formulation, and that's not so worrisome to the deep state because it encompasses this global security framework, and it basically doesn't really challenge the world economy. And in fact, his biggest boast is how much the stock market has risen since he became president. And his supporters think that's what's going to get him reelected. That is, if he survives these 4 years. And if the stock market survives him and the policies that he's pursued. Now, one interesting way of thinking about this situation that the US and the world is in at the present moment is whether it would have made much difference if Hillary Clinton had been elected rather than Trump. And most of people that my wife and I know thought it made a big difference and were terribly shocked and disturbed by the election of Trump. And as Max suggested in the introductory remarks, it also showed how out of touch people like ourselves are with the sentiments of a large proportion of American society. He indicated this is somewhat true here in Germany as well. I think it's a global phenomenon. I was in Egypt shortly after the Arab uprising of 2011, and the people in Egypt were completely out of touch with the sentiments of their own society. They thought that a Cairo mainstream person was going to be elected, a man named Amr Moussa, who had been the former Secretary General of the Arab League and a former foreign minister. And it turned out that when the presidential election came, he got less than 12% of the vote. And the Muslim Brotherhood got 3 times the vote that he got, and not counting the Salafi Islamic parties that also got over 20% of the vote. So it was a situation where secular intellectuals living in Cairo didn't understand their own country. And I'm suggesting that's become a global phenomenon, and why that's happened is an important thing to try to understand. Why have people so lost touch with their own societies? I think there still is an important difference between several important differences. I think the negative difference between Clinton and Trump is that Clinton was more of a person that works within the system, is a more responsible actor, is less likely to personalize global politics and have the kind of shouting match that Trump is having with the North Korean leader, who he called Rocket Man on a suicide mission in his, which isn't normal diplomatic rhetoric, and it seems like an incredibly irresponsible thing to do to a foreign leader that has the seeming temperament that Kim Jong-un appears to have. They seem more like twins than adversaries in many respects, but it's extremely dangerous, and it's a poker game between two sides bluffing with terrible hands. Each side has a terrible hand, and to bluff under those conditions is a suicide mission. And as we all know, if there was, if these threats ever materialize, tens of millions of people could die. I mean, and the world would not be the same. I mean, it would be catastrophe. And in that sense, Clinton would not have dealt with this crisis in the same way. Not that she would have dealt with it in a positive way. She would have repeated the threat diplomacy, but in a more measured, more tactful way, probably not personalized the conflict, but still avoided what I think is the only sensible response, which is what I would call restorative diplomacy rather than threat diplomacy. And restorative diplomacy rests on a premise of common security rather than national security. And it is the only thing. American leaders have been trying this threat diplomacy for the past 25 years, and it's proved to be a complete dead end. And if you're in the position of the North Korean leader, he sees that Iraq was attacked not because it had nuclear weapons, but because it didn't have them. And he sees that Libya abandoned nuclear weapons, their own nuclear weapons program, and it was intervened against. And that Iran, that has kept a kind of ambiguity, has not been attacked, at least up to now. So there is an alternative to this coercive diplomacy, which doesn't work. And one of the features of American policy that I would emphasize and have emphasized is what I call the great unlearned lesson of the Vietnam War. I regard the Vietnam War as really the turning point in American foreign policy. Not because it intervened so much, but because it misinterpreted the failure of the policy. Instead of understanding that military superiority no longer can control political outcomes the way it did in the 19th century and up through the first half of the 20th century, it continued to conceive of its security policy within a military box. Couldn't think outside the military box. So part of the decline of American global leadership is a decline of political imagination, an inability to adapt to a new situation. Because what the last half of the 20th century demonstrated was that almost every important political conflict ended with the victory of the side with the weaker military capabilities. All the anti-colonial wars. The most dramatic may have been the confrontation between India and the British Empire. In other words, these wars were basically won by the side that won what I call the legitimacy war. That is, the struggle for global and national public opinion, the gaining the high ground of international morality and international legality. And the delegitimation of colonialism empowered national resistance. It made countries understand that if they were patient enough and endured enough suffering, they would outlast the militarily superior side. And so this notion, the unlearned lesson of Vietnam is to keep reinventing military solutions to political problems. And even to repeat the notion that you can intervene and bring democracy at the end of a gun to, I mean, the Iraq War in 2003 was a disastrous repetition of the Vietnam failure. And it was, it rested on the proposition that in Vietnam, there wasn't enough done to bring democracy alongside the military intervention. And actually, I had another student, David Petraeus, who made his reputation. He became the military guru for reinventing Vietnam, essentially, saying we can win this kind of war if we pay more attention to the civil society. And so his reformulation of counterinsurgency doctrine in the post 9/11 context was the foundation for convincing the Bush president, George W. Bush presidency, that the Iraq War was a viable undertaking. So an important positive consequence of the developments in the last 75 years is the degree to which political outcomes rest on soft power primacy rather than on hard power. See, that's a very transformative reality to the extent it's true. It's not always true. It needs to be refined in different contexts, but it's generally true. There are very few exceptions. There are cases where countries have, or peoples have, won the legitimacy war but not been able to achieve the political outcome. Tibet is the most obvious case where there's no doubt that the Tibet achieved, for its claim of self-determination, the high legal and moral ground and the support of world public opinion, but the geopolitics are too strong in China's favor, and outside forces never felt it was worthwhile to challenge China for the sake of Tibetan independence. But still, if you look at most of the conflicts, they've either neutralized military intervention, as was done by the Vietnamese and to some extent by the Iraqis. In Vietnam, the outcome was not so geopolitically bad for the West and the United States because Vietnam was more worried about China than they were about the US and the West. And so they actually wanted to have positive relations with the West. In Iraq, it's quite different. The real winner in Iraq was Iran because of the Shiite dominance. So it was geopolitically disastrous as well as a failure of military intervention. And Afghanistan has some of the same features. That there's no doubt that 9/11 also is a turning point in the way in which U.S. foreign policy evolved. It was a turning point first because it revealed the vulnerability of this massive global state. That people with box cutters could inflict incredible harm, and that there was no real defense against that. But also what it did was to create a fear in the public that validated this homeland security structure that has actually diminished the quality of democracy within the US and has tended toward moving the society in a in this right populist direction. And it also created a political climate where the neoconservative foreign policy agenda suddenly could take hold and influence the way in which U.S. power was deployed in the world. And what the neoconservative agenda consisted of was shifting the central struggle of global politics from Europe to the Middle East. And what it wanted to do was to engage in a series of regime changes in the Middle East that would guarantee several things. One was the security of Israel. The second was the security of the oil reserves. The third was the avoidance of unwelcome forms of nuclear proliferation. And the fourth was the containment of political Islam. All of these things were expressed by the neoconservative leadership in documents before 9/11. There was a group that issued a vision of, was a critique of the Clinton foreign policy, and it was called a new foreign policy for a new century. But they recognized, and this has fed a lot of conspiracy theory about 9/11 itself, it recognized that the American people wouldn't support this neoconservative agenda without what was called a new Pearl Harbor. And 9/11 was the new Pearl Harbor, whether it was a conspiracy-generated 9/11 or an actual, didn't matter. It provided the political mandate for this shift, this aggressive and belligerent shift of focus to the Middle East. And of course, the results of this have been disastrous for the peoples of the region, and it lost much of its rationale because the oil politics have tended to not be as significant as they seemed to be 20 years ago. Alternate sources of oil have been easily discovered. There's less dependence on that region. So this set of developments, I think, makes one wonder what is in store for the future of American foreign policy. What can we really expect? And Trump gave this speech a couple of days ago in the United Nations, which can be read again in different ways. 21 times he used the word sovereignty in the speech, and tried to convey the message that every country in the world, including the United States, has a duty to put its national interests ahead of anything else, and that the UN is serving the world by providing that kind of framework. He also repeated this threat that had never been made before in the nuclear age, that if the security of the United States or of its allies is threatened, it will have no choice but to destroy North Korea totally. I mean, and that kind of threat, for one thing, is a direct violation of the UN Charter, where threats, besides uses of force, threats to attack another country are considered acts of aggression. And if you probably recall, at the Nuremberg trials here in Germany, the crime of aggression was considered the supreme crime that embraced everything else. And that's a really important understanding of the global order, that the greatest vulnerability is if especially important states engage in aggressive warfare, which the U.S. has done. Certainly the Iraq War of 2003 was an example of aggressive warfare. Probably the most encouraging feature of the Trump speech was downplaying conflict with Russia and China. And in that sense, maybe there still is a difference between what Clinton would have done and what Trump is doing. Maybe he still hopes he can please the deep state without totally alienating Russia, and that will avoid, hopefully, a renewal of the Cold War diplomacy and all that implies in terms of risk and danger. He made a kind of veiled reference to the sovereignty of Ukraine and the sovereignty of the South China Seas, but it was a very parenthetical remark in the context of the speech as a whole. What one didn't see is any sign, any affirmative message. Nothing about climate change, nothing about trying to get rid of nuclear weapons, nothing about addressing global migration as a shared problem. So that what one, I think, is left with is a complete absence of positive global leadership at this stage, and a serious vulnerability to the breakdown of crisis management, most obviously in relation to North Korea. But there are also these, on the one hand, the affirmation of sovereignty, and then the attack on countries like Cuba and Venezuela, because they are, as he said, it's not because they are not enacting socialism, but because they're faithfully following socialist precepts, which seems to be quite in contradiction with saying countries, the most important principle in the world is sovereignty. So if you have to decode that, that means sovereignty provided you hew the capitalist line. And sovereignty, provided you don't become an Islamically oriented governing country. So it's a very modest form of, a very modest concept of non-intervention in the internal affairs of other countries. So I think, let me end where I began, which is the seeming inability of the U.S. to play the necessary global leadership role, and wondering whether that leadership role can come from any other source of authority and influence in the world. The Chinese speech at the Global Economic Forum this year, the president of China, Xi Xuanyu, did propose nuclear disarmament, did propose a multipolar kind of global order, which had certain, I mean, it at least was something, put forward a kind of more positive image than anything that has issued from Washington. One would hope maybe that would challenge the West. Maybe the EU has a kind of future role to play in reinforcing or displacing this role that the U.S. had played since 1945. But let me stop by thanking you for your patience and hoping that that I've been provocative enough to produce some questions.
We have a seminar, we have an intimate setting, so please go ahead. We are ready to discuss whatever questions you have.
Reluctantly. At the beginning, until he campaigned, I was determined not to vote for either of them. But when I listened to what he was saying, and particularly what he was saying about how to deal with immigrants and Islam and the internal, his policies internally are very cruel to people, very insensitive and cruel, and not necessary from any point of view. And that convinced me that it was irresponsible. And then the people he had around him worried me. The Breitbart, the alt-right, you know what's called the alt-right now? Well, Congress has sort of been, it's hard to say. They never the Republican Party, you have to recognize, really they didn't want him as their candidate. And so it's a very peculiar kind of relationship. But they thought they could use him to enact their agenda, which was basically a right-wing tax reform, very pro-business, very pro-Wall Street. And they even swallowed his opposition to global trade, which was normally a Republican issue. But they shared the immigration and the trying to deport a lot of people that were in the U.S. for a long time as illegal immigrants. There were something like 11 million people. So there were the domestic agenda, which hasn't been noticed so much outside the U.S., was what was very influential in my own thinking. Internationally, I'm not sure there's much difference, except the Korean confrontation is worrisome. I mean, no, I don't believe. I think there are reasons to be suspicious about it. There's some unanswered questions, and the people in the U.S. and in the world deserve answers to those questions. And people have studied this, including some serious scholars that raise serious questions that have not been handled in a responsible way. So there may be some middle ground where there was some sense that something was going to happen that they didn't try to stop. You know, that's a kind of middle ground, that it wasn't a false flag, but it was something that the neoconservative leadership allowed to happen. Donald Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defense, made a very suspicious statement on the first anniversary of 9/11. He called it a blessing in disguise. And by that he meant it allowed us to do things that we couldn't have done without 9/11. And that meant really the Iraq War. I think it's not totally, it's not the only explanation for why Iran has been more stable and more successful in governing than any other political system in the region. The diplomacy after World War I, which was dominated by European colonial objectives, divided up the Ottoman Empire, that so-called Sykes-Picot secret agreement between the French and the British. It included Palestine, plus the Balfour Declaration, which created this Jewish homeland, support for the Jewish homeland in Palestine. The combination of those two colonial moves created a group of artificial political communities in the region. And those artificial political communities could only be held together by a strong dictatorial leader. So, and there's a phrase that's very popular in the Arab world, which is, people prefer 100 years of tyranny to 1 year of chaos. See, and it's that preference for order over democratic participation that has been so destructive when you try to force democracy down the throats of these societies. And again, the Iraq War was the poster child of that misconceived policy. And just one final point about Iran, that people that have been studying Iran recently suggest that in its own way, it's become the most democratically oriented society in the region, not by Western standards, but there is real political participation. The public has selected more moderate leaders to the extent that they've had the vote, so that there's a certain reason to feel a kind of guarded optimism that the evolution of Iranian society is something looks much better than what you can look toward with the other main countries in the region.
Maybe two more questions. Anyone? You had one more. Okay.
Well, the U.S. is a big, giant abstraction, and there are certainly people in the U.S., I consider myself one of them, who do care, but they're not running the country, they're not running the government. I think they care about international law when it's on their side. See, and that's not just Trump. I think that's been true ever since the end of World War II. International law is fine when it works in support of your foreign policy. The test, though, is whether you conform to international law when it contradicts your foreign policy. I've made the argument that the U.S. would be much better off if it did accept the discipline of international law. It wouldn't have had the Vietnam disaster. It wouldn't have had these other drastic failures. It would have a much stronger global reputation. International law is much more consistent with principled realism or pragmatic realism than is this kind of discretionary use of force in a historical period where military power has lost much of its capacity to achieve change. It did have that capacity up until the end of World War II, but it's lost that capacity, and in a way it's a good thing that it lost the capacity. But the elites that govern the world, by and large, have not recognized that change in the relationship between hard and soft power, really.
Richard, that is, I would say those are brilliant concluding remarks. I mean, at this, right there, because that is really, that puts it all together. So it's been an honor. It's been a true privilege and a pleasure to see you again, to have you here.
Well,
thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you very much, Max. It's been great to be here.
Thank you very much.